As we look back upon first-century Judea, we find a particular religious community in conflict with its host society about the meaning of their shared tradition. The people inside the community claim that they have entered into the new covenant promised by God through the prophet Jeremiah, a renewal of the covenant that their ancestors had broken, and from which the majority of their fellow Jews remained alienated by their stubborn refusal to obey the leader of this sect. They claim that they alone fulfill God's law properly, since they believe God's law is only followed properly as it was interpreted in the teachings of their departed leader, the righteous teacher. They claim that the sacred scriptures, especially the Psalms and the prophets, find their true meaning when they are read in light of the life story of their departed leader, particularly in light of his run-ins with the Jerusalem authorities. The new community also finds its own story reflected in those prophetic books. They are the ones who have answered the charge of the prophet Isaiah, who cried out to Israel to prepare in the wilderness the way of the Lord, to make straight in the desert a path for our God. They prepare this pathway by their ordering of their own steps in line with the commandments of God's covenant as illumined by their teacher. These same prophets also foretell the future woes of Israel and the final triumph of God and the children of light over the children of darkness. This community is highly critical of the temple, administered by the wicked priest, who observes every Sabbath and festival at the wrong time because he follows a lunar calendar rather than the solar calendar adopted by the sect. Believing that God does not look with favor upon the offerings made in the temple, the community looks to itself as a place where mediation between God and God's people happens, without the need for animal sacrifices. As a place where holiness is rightly observed, the community becomes a place where atonement for the land, without the flesh of whole burnt offerings and the fat of sacrifice, can be made, where prayer rightly offered shall be like an acceptable fragrance of righteousness, and righteous living a delectable free will offering. Much of this description may have suggested that I have been speaking about the early church, for the early Christians did see themselves as the people of the new covenant. They understood God's law to be fulfilled only when followed in light of Jesus' teachings about the meaning and application of the law. They read the Jewish scriptures, especially the Psalms and the prophets, as testimonies to the career of their leader and to the ongoing story of their community. They regard their own group to be a kind of replacement for the temple, the new place where God's Spirit dwelt and where acceptable sacrifices of praise and service were offered without the blood of bulls and goats. But in fact, I have been speaking about the sect that inhabited the settlement at Qumran, the community largely responsible for producing the texts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fact that the strictest sect within Judaism could speak thus about traditional Jewish institutions like the temple and about the rest of their fellow Jews helps us understand that the mode of interacting with the tradition that we see in Jesus and his first followers is also very Jewish. It is an inner Jewish mode of wrestling with the tradition, even when it seems to reject or replace key elements of that tradition or of the way other Jews live out the tradition. We can get a firmer grasp of the nature of this interaction by taking as an example the concept of the New Covenant. Luke and Paul both speak of the cup passed around at the Lord's Supper as the New Covenant in Jesus' blood. The author of Hebrews develops at much greater length the interpretation of Jesus' death as the inauguration of the New Covenant. The idea of a community of the New Covenant is used to distinguish followers of Jesus from the many other Jews who worship the one God and claim to belong to the covenant. The concept may suggest radical discontinuity with the Old Covenant, and in fact led the early 2nd century heretic Marcion to claim that Christians had no need of the Old Testament or of anything that savored of Judaism. But the New Covenant is itself an ancient traditional concept. In the 6th century BC, Jeremiah promised that God would make a new covenant with Israel and Judah. While this was to be different from the former covenant, it derives its meaningfulness from that former covenant in two ways. First, the very notion that God relates to God's people through a covenant, an agreement that maintains a mutual relationship with mutual responsibilities, connects the new with the old. Second, the new covenant is seen to be nothing other than the renewal and the internalization of the former covenant. The vision for human community and for the relationship between human beings and God captured in the law of Moses would finally be made effective in people's lives by being written in their hearts and their minds. Paul himself would write that the just requirements of the law, meaning the law of Moses, would be fulfilled as disciples walked in line with the Holy Spirit that God gave them, the ultimate internalization of God's desires for God's people. Where there is a covenant people, we find attention being given to the question of who is included in this covenant. The lines of the new covenant are now drawn around the outpouring of God's favor in Jesus and in the giving of the Holy Spirit. The fact that the terms of belonging to the first covenant are claimed on behalf of the people who follow Jesus shows just how fully the first covenant is operating as the framework that gives meaning to the new covenant. Paul will claim in Philippians that we are the circumcision, even though circumcision is not a requirement for belonging to the church. He will also claim in Galatians that if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, because for him it is precisely connection with Abraham, that ancient figure who received God's promises, that makes one a part of the covenant with God. The author of 1 Peter addresses mixed bodies of Gentile and Jewish Christians with a collection of titles traditionally used to describe ethnic Jews. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's peculiar possession. In Galatians 6, we find Paul claiming that the followers of Jesus, in fact, are Israel. Conversely, we also observe in these texts the felt need to explain why it is that not everyone who lays claim to the same tradition has arrived at the same understanding of that tradition, and so lives it out in the same way. Most often, this amounts to explaining why we are right in regard to understanding and walking in line with the tradition, and they are not, even using the scriptures themselves as resources for discovering this explanation, as Paul does throughout Romans 9 to 11. Or as Jesus does at the conclusion of the parable of the wicked tenants in Matthew 21. Related to this are the many episodes where we see Jesus in conflict with other Jewish teachers, criticizing their appropriation of the tradition and perhaps their own innovations on the tradition, but always reaching back to the traditions of the law, the prophets, and the writings in his own mission of renewal. Both the criticism of traditional practices and institutions and the construction of new meanings and institutions consistently require interaction with the tradition. Innovation itself only comes as people reach back into the tradition to discover a reinterpretation of a well-known tradition or to elevate to prominence a formerly obscure and overlooked tradition. For example, the author of Hebrews certainly magnifies the importance of Melchizedek, the priest-king who blessed Abraham and received a tithe from the patriarch, in order to make room for Jesus as the high priest in the priestly line of Melchizedek, who replaces the Levitical priesthood and all its sacrifices. It is essential for us to recognize that the word new in New Testament or New Covenant does not in any way diminish the importance for us of the old. The statements made by early Christians do not reflect a rejection of the tradition, but rather a debate about how to be faithful to the tradition, and thus how to continue to respond faithfully to God. Rather than leaving us adrift in a sea of relativity, the scriptural tradition, reflected in both testaments, provides an enduring compass point for navigating a path of faithful response to the God who engages us anew in the present.
You know, one of the striking moments in Paul's letter to the Romans is really a moment of anguish. He begins Romans 9 talking about this great sorrow and unceasing anguish that he has over his own people, the people of Israel, and particularly how they have been cut off from Christ, he says. And there's this real tension that runs through. He takes quite a bit of time to explore this issue in Romans 9 through 11 and tries to wrestle with it. And I think we should think together some about how Paul attempts to resolve this issue, if he does it well at all.
Yeah, and not only how he attempts to resolve it, but why he raises the question in the first place, because it is a question of some urgency to people in the Roman community, where there are some Jews who have signed on to the Christian program, and most Jews have not. So how does the Gentile Christian react to all those Jews out there who have not signed on? How does one deal with one's relative who has not, seen the light? So the question is incredibly urgent for Paul. He manages to find some scriptural background for his understanding, and in a very nice Pharisaic or Jewish way says, well, God set it up this way, but it's also their own fault. It's a combination of fate and free will. But then he offers out this hope that at the end all Israel will be saved.
Paul spends a lot of time in Romans 9 to 11 trying to make sense of what he might even see as an anomaly.
Yeah, it's a problem I think many Christians have today, too. What is so self-evident for Paul, what's so self-evident for many Christians is bizarre to people on the outside. What, you believe in a crucified Messiah? I mean, Paul does admit that it's a scandal and a folly. For many Jews today, it's hard for us to understand why Christians would come in and say, well, isn't it self-evident that Jesus is the Messiah? Because we look out the window and say, where's the Messianic age? Where's the end of war and death and disease and hatred? Because for Jews today, at least those Jews who do believe that a Messiah is coming, the Messiah and the Messianic age come together. It's a package. Jesus couldn't be the Messiah then because there's no Messianic age. And then when the Christian says, well, he saves us from sin and death, the Jewish response is, well, as Jesus would put it, God is the God of the living. Of course God saves. Traditional Jews believe in resurrection of the dead, so we don't need Jesus to give us that. And we believe that God always forgives a contrite heart, so we don't need Jesus' sacrifice to provide some sort of atonement or forgiveness for us. The upshot is, Jews define the Messiah differently than Christians do, so of course what's self-evident to one group is incomprehensible to the other.
It's sounding like Jews also have wrestled a lot with the anomaly, if I could put it this way, of Gentiles, of Christians, claiming to be true Israel, true circumcision. You've worked as hard to make sense of the other side as perhaps Paul has.
There are rabbinic documents, probably dated after the Roman Empire had become Christian, when finally Jews realized, oh, this Gentile Christian phenomenon, it looks like it's going to be around for a while. The government seems to have joined with the program. And they describe the relationship between church and synagogue as the relationship between Jacob and Esau. Now, the church is using the same metaphor. It's a question of who gets to be Jacob and who gets to be Esau. Right. But the nice thing about the metaphor is that each group recognizes the other as part of the family. And Jacob and Esau, for all their difficulties, do eventually reconcile. So at least some rabbinic Jews are willing to say the Christians, they're worshiping the right God. They are being moral. They are following at least the moral parts of the Ten Commandments. At least we hope that they are. So there's a recognition that it is somewhat in the family. As far as today's Jewish community goes, some Jews, Christianity is off the radar. Other Jews are more than happy to recognize Christians as part of the family, and I would count myself there, because I recognize the church and the synagogue and the mosque all as children of Abraham, worshiping the same God, but using different pathways to get there.
And yet we really shouldn't deceive ourselves to think that there aren't some difficult passages in the New Testament that have perhaps set up trajectories that have led us in negative ways. Matthew 23, phrases like the synagogue of Satan. So we do have some difficult texts in the Gospel of Matthew, for example.
Sure. Matthew 23, which is the woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you do absolutely everything wrong that I can possibly think of.
Yeah.
When we look at Jesus talking to fellow Jews, that he would use such extreme language makes perfect sense, because so did the prophets. So, and Jews are used to this. They heard it from Jeremiah, they heard it from Hosea, they heard it from Ezekiel. The problem is when Jesus' words spoken by a Jew to other Jews are then lifted up and put in the canon of what becomes the Gentile church. Internal dialogue becomes this form of external polemic. What Christians reading this text should do then is identify with Jesus' Jewish audience, because Jews certainly don't have a lock on things like hypocrisy. The unfortunate thing is that too many Christian readers will say, oh, well, he's condemning those Jews, and thank God I'm not like them. So it's the problem of Christian readership and occasionally falsely identifying with Jesus and saying, I'm not like the people he's criticizing.
So understanding Jesus in more of an in-house conflict, in-house
Absolutely.
controversy.
He's a Jew talking to other Jews. And for the church as it develops, for example, Synagogue of Satan, which shows up in the book of Revelation, it wouldn't surprise me that one Jew would look over at a rival synagogue and make a comment like that. I mean, I've certainly known church people to talk about other churches as, oh, that's the church where Satan goes, or that's the church of the Antichrist. I mean, this sort of polemical language is, I think, part of human nature. What we need to do is recognize that polemics set in one particular time period ought not to carry into the next time period. I think perhaps the best example of this is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, where the crowd ostensibly says, his blood be on us and on our children. And that verse was used by churches throughout the centuries to justify persecution of Jews, as if all Jews from all times are responsible for the death of Jesus and should be punished accordingly.
So what do we do now? How do Christians relate to Jews in a way that is faithful to the New Testament tradition? Do we take up where Peter and his team left off and try to keep evangelizing the circumcision?
Where I find evangelism to be done in a helpful way is for Christians to go out and do something. Build a house for Habitat for Humanity, do a mission trip, tutor some kid after school, be nice. And if somebody says, well, why do you do that? Then the response ought to be something like, the love of Christ compels me to do this, or I do this because I'm a Christian. That's a nice way of showing what the religion stands for. I certainly think one should be able to share faith, but to respect the Jewish neighbor, or the Muslim neighbor, whoever, enough to say, I'd really like to share my faith in Jesus with you. And if the response is, well, that's nice, but I'm really not interested, to have the decency to go away. But should the Christian evangelize? Of course. Should the Christian be willing to accept no graciously? Yeah, I think so, for the sake of common decency and for showing love to the neighbor.